Hey guys, this is Josh Nelson with Nelson Elder Care Law. So glad for you to join us today. We're going to be talking about a topic that I get asked about nearly every day. The questions that always pop up whenever we meet with families are, my loved one is getting sick to the point that maybe they're going to need some around the clock care. Maybe they're going to need something where they go to rehab for a little bit. And we have this disturbing lesson that we just learned that this stuff's really expensive. What do we do? And maybe there's a little bit of research that's been done online, and they realize that there's a program called Medicaid that can help pay for what's called long-term care or skilled nursing facility type level care. It's around the clock nursing care, and it's really expensive. In our state, it averages between 7,000 all the way up to nine, sometimes even $10,000 a month, and most families can't afford to pay that. And so the way that they help subsidize that is usually with either long-term care insurance, which a lot of people just don't have or just couldn't afford whenever it was available to them, or now couldn't get because it's no longer medically underwritable for them, or they have to start pulling from savings. And that's pretty scary. If something happens where you planned ahead or you've made it so that you have this nest egg or retirement in a home, one of the scary things is what happens to my house? Do we lose the house? I hear these horror stories talking about people that go into a nursing home and the state comes and takes their home. Well, we want to clarify some of that for you today. What we're going to talk about is how to qualify for Medicaid without losing your house. And so, a lot of people, whenever they first start hearing about Medicaid or doing some research into it, they only get a partial bit of the story. And so, we want to fill in those gaps for you today. One of the biggest things that people worry about is as we get older and we take that 30-year mortgage and we finally get it paid off and we got a lot of equity in our home, we think it's protected. In Georgia, we actually don't have really great homestead protection laws. And so if something happens where you go into a nursing home where you have medical expenses or creditors like that, they can come put a lien on your home. That's pretty scary, and sometimes that's contrary to what people read about Medicaid. Where Medicaid is a program that covers the difference between your income and what your cost of care is if you need skilled nursing care. And so for most people, that's north of $7,000 a month. And so that's a pretty big chunk of equity coming out of your home every month. Now, the good news is they don't come and just like kick your spouse out on the street. You're allowed to have it as exempt for what's called qualification purposes, which means that you can still own a home, even if it's over the asset thresholds that we've talked about in some of the other videos. Remember, it's about 129,000 for a couple or 2,000 for an individual. If your equity exceeds that, you can still qualify for Medicaid. But then they have this really shady portion, which is called estate recovery. Sometimes you hear it called clawback, which is where whenever the person that's actually receiving the care passes, the state has a lien on the property and then they get paid back for whatever they've paid in care. And remember that $7,000 a month figure, that can eat through any kind of equity in the home very fast. One of the big questions that people are always afraid of is, do they get the whole value of the house? Often not. And because most people have more equity in their house, say you have $100,000 of equity in your house or $200,000 of equity in your house, whenever we start adding that $7,000 a month up, it would take a couple of years before we actually get to the point that they would be able to have all the value of the home. So it does mean that they get a big chunk though. And how they get that is not by kicking your spouse out. Remember, if they were literally going door to door and kicking healthy spouses out of their house because their sick spouse just passed, that would make the news really quick. The way that they do it is they have a lien, sort of similar to the way that you'd have a covenant on your house, or sometimes people think of it best as like a mortgage. There's this amount that you can't sell your house without paying back. And so it's the same as like if you have a construction worker come out to your house and you don't pay them for a job, they put like a mechanic's lien on your property. It's just a mark on your title that says this property cannot be transferred without paying back this lien. Because that lien can be excessive, a lot of people end up losing the majority of value in the home. We're going to talk today about how we avoid that and also some of the reasons that it's really important that we avoid that and plan ahead. One of the things that a lot of people don't think about is that the house is considered exempt up to $572,000. That's a big chunk of change. Most houses for people that we deal with don't exceed that cap. If your house does exceed that cap, we need to talk right away about pre-planning though, because for you in your home, it would not even be considered exempt for application purposes. And that's really scary. And a couple really easy techniques that we can go over to make it so that that is considered a non-countable asset for you, but it does require that we plan a little bit in advance. One of the other options that you often hear is things like put your kids' names on a house. This is a very, very unfortunate idea. People hear this because they know that it protects against probate if you put your kids' names on a house as joint with rights of survivorship. What people often run into then, though, is that they get what's called a step up in basis whenever they pass and their kids' names aren't on the house, whether that passes through probate or through a trust. But whenever your kids' names are on the deed, what's called joint with rights of survivorship, you don't get that step up in basis. And what that means is that whenever you pass and then your heirs finally sell your home, they have to pay taxes or capital gains on the sale of your home rather than just having it as a tax free sale. And a lot of times people find that that cost is a lot higher than what they imagine. Imagine that that rate is even at 15% and you have a $300,000 home. That can really add up to about $45,000 in potential gain. And that could be really troublesome for people. Where if we just spend some time in advanced planning, we can skip all that, save the $45,000 that would have been the taxes, as well as keep it so that it's not eligible for Medicaid recovery. Often, people will hear that you can have a child caregiver come and stay with you, and if you do that, your house will be protected. There's some details to this that a lot of people leave out. It's important that whenever your child lives with you, they are not only just living with you for convenience of you and them, but that they're actually providing you care that prohibits you from going to the nursing home or keeps you at home longer than what would otherwise be necessary if you didn't have that caregiver. This is very, very hard to prove if that child has a full-time job. So if your son lives with you and he's working 40 hours a week, it's going to be hard to show how he's giving you enough care and working full-time to keeping you out of some kind of care community. Whenever we start talking about what that care looks like, it doesn't have to necessarily mean that they're in like the bath washing your back. It could be just hygiene help, making sure you don't slip and fall in the bathtub, helping you manage medication, helping make sure that you're safe if you have some cognitive impairment. There are some loopholes there, but it's really important that whenever we think about it from the perspective of what that care looks like, that it's well documented. A lot of times, the documentation is the piece that's missing here. The other problem that we run into is that the person needs to be there for about 24 months. If it's less than 24 months, there's a good chance that this strategy doesn't work. So like we talked about with transfers, they need to happen about 60 months in advance. With this strategy, it still needs to be about 24 months. And usually by the time people realize that they're going down this care path, they're already within that 24-month window, so it's not a viable strategy. Another strategy that you'll often see people try and use is by having a spouse. And if their spouse is listed on the property, depending on how the spouse is listed, sometimes they can still avoid that lien. In Georgia, there's a couple ways to own property with other people, but one of the most common is what's called tenants in common. That means that if me and one other person own a property together as tenants in common, we have the issue where each one of us technically owns 50%. If this is the case and one of us ends up going into Medicaid, we qualify because the house is exempt for qualification purposes. But then whenever we get to the point with that clawback, if I pass and I'm the one in the nursing home, Medicaid can take up to that 50% of my property. This causes a real problem for the other owner. First, what if the property isn't marketable? What if the property isn't available to have a debt instrument like a loan or something to pay back the lien? Then we have this problem where the person has some use and enjoyment of it, but can the state come and force a sale? Or whenever the person does sell it, what kind of penalties do they have to pay back to the state? It's a really, really scary strategy. The better part of this is what's called joint with rights of survivorship. Whenever we own property joint with rights of survivorship, what that means is that say me and one other person own a property, one of us owns it 100% whenever the first one of us passes. We don't know which one yet because we don't really know who will die first. A lot of times couples will use this strategy if they think that one spouse is sicker than the other and that that spouse is going into the nursing home and the other one is going to outlive. Often this is an option. Unfortunately, the part that people don't think about is that if something happens where you're a caregiver for your spouse, that puts such a toll on you health wise and stress wise that often you may be the one to pass first. If this is the strategy that we used with joint with right of survivorship and the healthy spouse passes before the spouse that's in the nursing home, the state can actually come back and get the full value of the lien still. And that's a real problem. So, what is the option? How do we fight through this and make sure the house is going to be protected? The really important part is that it needs to happen in advance. When is the best time to do it? 5 years and a day before you and your spouse get sick. But because none of us have a crystal ball, we suggest moving on it right away. What we do is take your home and put it into what's called a Medicaid Asset Protection Trust, which is a specific type of trust that protects the home and other assets from being qualified for Medicaid. It moves them into an exempt status that makes it so that if something happens to you or your spouse, those assets inside this Medicaid Asset Protection Trust do not have to be counted as your assets on the application process or as part of clawback. That's really, really important, especially whenever we think that we spend so much of our lives working to pay off some of these big assets, such as homes, building up different investment accounts. We want to protect those from just disappearing because of these uncertain curveballs of life, such as needing to go through medical expenses. As another great benefit of the Asset Protection Trust, it allows you to skip the probate process and add a little bit extra control as far as what happens to your stuff whenever you do pass, so we can protect it for your spouse as well. In order to accomplish this, it does take sitting down with you and really going over what you want. A lot of people are intimidated by this process just because it's things we don't want to think about, but it's very, very helpful whenever we look at this. Remember, there's really only 3 strategies to be able to keep your home. And so to recap, those are going to be that you plan ahead with some kind of asset protection strategy. We know that if you do this, you can save 100% of the value in your home. Even if something happens where you don't have that full 5 year time window, there's a good chance that we can come up with a strategy to save the majority of it, if not all of it. The second strategy is going to be plan on having your spouse outlive you and make sure that your house is deeded the appropriate way. It has a lot of risk with that though, because there's just certain curveballs in life that we can't foresee, like us passing before our spouse or our spouse passing before us, or both of you being sick at the same time. Then ultimately there is a last resort of trying to use the child caregiver exception. The problem with this is really documentation and timing. Again, a lot of people that go into these kind of care situations do so suddenly. It's something like a stroke, a heart attack, a fall, cognitive impairment that goes unnoticed for years until it becomes unmanageable. These are things that unfortunately you can't foresee 24 months in advance to be able to use this strategy effectively. It doesn't mean it's not available, it just means it's harder to implement for most families. Again, we know that whenever somebody needs this around the clock care, it can be very, very expensive. Most people's income will not cover it. There is a great program called Medicaid that will cover that care whenever you need the around the clock skilled nursing. But in order to protect your assets, in order to protect your livelihood and your home that you've worked so hard to build up, it's really important that you plan ahead with a strategy. Again, we've given you 3 strategies today that can work. I highly suggest you use the one that's the plan ahead version because it is the one that offers 100% protection, as well as gives you the certainty that if something happens to you, you're protected. Appreciate you joining us today. Do we have any kind of questions? Well, I'm glad to see that you guys jumped on with us. We appreciate it. If you're looking for other topics or other information, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook. Give us a little